Few records still remain from the early 9th century of European history. Many dates and names have been lost forever, leaving little behind for those who follow to try to piece together a life. So was it in the case of the first years of Æthelwulf, the only son of Ecgbert, a Kentish prince who had fled from England to seek refuge at the court of Charlemagne in Francia in around 876. When and where Æthelwulf was born, and even who his mother was, are unknown. The most well-known contendant to be his mother was Redbolga, a Frankish princess and relative of Charlemagne, although many historians now doubt that she was his mother. If she was his mother, then he was probably born at Atcham, which was Charlemagne's favourite residence. Æthelwulf's father Ecgbert had fled to Francia after being forced to leave England when he unsuccessfully tried to lay claim to the throne of Wessex, one of the southern English kingdoms. The new king Beorhtric was keen to remove Ecgbert as a potential rival, and had taken steps to see him executed before Ecgbert had fled. If Æthelwulf had been born during this time, then he would have spent his first years as an exiled prince in the court of Charlemagne, without any inheritance or future to speak of. That changed in 802, with the sudden death of Beorhtric. Shortly afterwards, Ecgbert, probably with the support of Charlemagne, returned to Wessex to try to claim the throne once more, presumably taking the infant Æthelwulf with him if he had indeed been born by this time. Upon Ecgbert's return to Wessex, he met with the Witan, who were a body of lords responsible for appointing the new king, and he was chosen to succeed Beorhtric as King of Wessex. In 802, Wessex was one of the most powerful southern kingdoms in England, but it was still less politically influential than Mercia on Wessex's northern border. All other southern Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were loyal to Mercia and their king Æthelwulf, and Ecgbert chose to adopt an isolationist foreign policy from them. Assuming that Æthelwulf had not been born during Ecgbert's exile in Francia, then it would have been during the first years of his father's reign that he was born. Either way, Æthelwulf would have grown up surrounded by courtiers teaching him the ways of war, kingship, and the church, all three of which would prove to have left a deep impact on him. The first 20 years of Ecgbert's reign are shrouded in mystery. While it is possible that he used this time to deliberately hunt down Beorhtric's old supporters, the only thing that is known that Ecgbert did during this time was going to war against and subjugating the kingdom of Dumnonia, one of the last kingdoms made up of predominantly Roman Britons. It is entirely possible that Ecgbert brought his son on campaign with him during this time, however there are no records of him being there. Æthelwulf didn't formally enter the annals of history until 825. By this time the king of Mercia was a man named Beornwulf, who had dreams of finally bringing Wessex under Mercian control. Waiting until Ecgbert and presumably Æthelwulf were putting down the Dumnonians, Beornwulf invaded Wessex with an army in September of 825. Ecgbert and Æthelwulf rushed towards the Mercian army with their own forces, and the two armies met at a place known at the time as Ellendon in Wiltshire. While the exact size of the two armies are unknown, it is considered to have been a decisive engagement, meaning that the majority of the armies of Wessex and Mercia were likely to have been there. While Æthelwulf's exact deeds are not recorded in the battle, it is likely that he was put in command of a line of cavalry, which would have been common for the time. In any case, Wessex ultimately prevailed, with the West Saxon forces chasing the Mercians from the field. As soon as the battle was over, Ecgbert sent Æthelwulf with a good portion of his army to head east and force the smaller kingdoms of Kent, Essex, Surrey and Sussex to accept the overlordship of Wessex. These kingdoms had previously accepted Mercian dominance, but Æthelwulf's father wanted to strip the once great kingdom of much of its power in the south, as well as assuring Wessex's position as the new dominant kingdom. Kent in particular was an area that Ecgbert wanted to take, given that his own father, Ehermund, had been king of Kent for a time, and Ecgbert and Æthelwulf viewed this land as their own personal property. At the time, the king of Kent was a man called Baldred, who had risen to power with the help of Beornwulf. However, Baldred fled as Æthelwulf's army approached, and Æthelwulf accepted the submission of the smaller kingdoms without a fight. It was then that his father decided to combine these smaller kingdoms into a single kingdom, called the Kingdom of Kent, and that he would grant it to Æthelwulf to rule as a sub-king under the oversight of Ecgbert. Ecgbert's thinking seems to have been for Æthelwulf to learn the ways of a king on a smaller scale, before going on to inherit Wessex when Ecgbert died. Father and son reigned peacefully together in the south of England, and shared power between them reasonably well. Ecgbert seems to have respected Æthelwulf's independence, and there are records not only of Æthelwulf's making laws and orders in his own name, but also Ecgbert making requests of his son rather than commanding him. The two kings were able to rule peacefully over their new territory by relying on using local earls and nobles to rule through, making them genuinely popular with the people. They also took steps to gain favour with the church, although this was compromised when Æthelwulf seized control of East Mailing, which belonged to Canterbury Church. Given that stealing church land was something not even a king could do, there was an outrage until Æthelwulf pointed out that the land had only been given to the church by Baldred shortly after he had fled, and therefore had not been given legally. Nevertheless, there was peace in Kent and Wessex for a time. However, it wouldn't last. Ecgbert was hungry for more victories, and, in 829, he launched a grand assault against Mercia, now ruled by a new king, Wiglaf. It is unknown if Æthelwulf joined his father in the campaign, but he may have stayed in Kent to shore up their control of the south while his father went north. Ecgbert's war went well at first, and he was able to chase Wiglaf away and claim control of Mercia, before Wiglaf returned and Ecgbert was forced to abandon control of Mercia permanently. However, for a brief time, Ecgbert had managed to take control of the majority of England, so he was proclaimed Bretwalda, meaning Britain ruler. It was around this time that Æthelwulf married his first wife, a young woman called Osber. She was the daughter of Oslach, an important member of Æthelwulf's court, and a descendant of the first conquerors of the Isle of Wight, making Osber a wise marriage. The pair would go on to have 6 children who would reach adulthood, these children being 5 sons, Athelstan, Athelbold, Athelbert, Athelred, and Alfred, and 1 daughter, Athelswith. These healthy children all established that the line of Wessex was a strong one, and guaranteeing that it would persist beyond Æthelwulf and his father. In 836, Vikings landed in Charmouth, and Ecgbert was defeated in battle against them. Although it is unlikely that Æthelwulf was present for the battle, he may have come to his father's aid 2 years later at the Battle of Higston Downs, which saw the Vikings flee Wessex, although again his presence is not recorded. In 838, Ecgbert called his son to meet with him at the town of Kingston in Surrey. The old king was dying, and he knew it was time to begin making preparations for Æthelwulf's ascension. It had been 200 years since a king had been able to peacefully hand the crown from father to son, yet Ecgbert was determined to accomplish this. To ensure the backing of the church, Ecgbert returned the East Mailing land to Canterbury Church if they agreed to accept Æthelwulf as king. Ecgbert's incredible wealth that he had gained over the years also helped him to ensure that the Witan would agree to make Æthelwulf the new king after Ecgbert died. They wouldn't have to wait long. Within a year, Ecgbert of Wessex was dead, and Æthelwulf was proclaimed King of Wessex. One of Æthelwulf's first decisions after taking full power was to crown his eldest son, Athelstan, King of Kent, continuing his father's tradition. However, unlike his father, Æthelwulf did not leave Athelstan to rule completely in his own right, and he made several trips there personally to oversee the area, as well as making decisions regarding the kingdom without receiving Athelstan's approval first. Æthelwulf also worked to keep good relations with Mercia. Unlike his father, Æthelwulf did not have expansionist ambitions, and he wanted peace across his realm. Despite losing most of Mercia in 830, Ecgbert had managed to hold on to control of London. However, Æthelwulf returned it to Mercian control as a gesture of goodwill, which was well appreciated. Towards the end of Æthelwulf's first decade as king, he befriended a Frankish man called Felix, who served as his secretary. Together, the two men helped transform the West Saxon court into one that more closely resembled the court of Charlemagne. It was also their effort that kept Latin used as the language that official charters were drawn up in, unlike most other kingdoms where Latin was being phased out. Despite Æthelwulf's hopes for peace, one threat continued to loom its head over the country. Viking invasions were becoming more and more common, and in 843, 35 Viking ships landed in Charmouth, in the exact same location they had done so 7 years earlier. Æthelwulf rallied his army and personally led them into battle against the Danes, but, like his father before him, was overwhelmed and forced to retreat. However, this time the Vikings themselves left only shortly afterwards, making it a Pyrrhic victory. Yet this was only the very beginning of the true attacks, as the Vikings continued to attack the coastline for several years. In 850, Athelstan led a naval army against a Viking attack force off the coast of Kent, in what is believed to be the first ever naval battle in English history. Athelstan was victorious, but he died shortly afterwards, likely from wounds he sustained in the fight. Soon afterwards, a much larger host of Vikings landed near London and seized the city. King Bertwulf of Mercia rallied against them, but he was defeated and driven back. Shortly afterwards, the Vikings moved on to attack into Surrey, but Æthelwulf and his second son Athelbold led an army to block their path at Acklea. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports that the crews of over 350 Viking ships were present, making the Battle of Acklea one of the largest Viking battles in history. The two great armies smashed into each other, and after a bloody fight, Æthelwulf's army prevailed, pushing the Vikings from the field and claiming victory. Æthelwulf's renown for his martial prowess spread throughout Christendom, and he received congratulations from the Frankish Empire for his victory. In 853, Æthelwulf sent his youngest sons, Æthelred and Alfred, on a pilgrimage to Rome. While there has been some suggestion that he did this in preparation for at least Alfred taking on a life in the clergy, the reality probably was that he wanted to show the rest of Christendom that he had several strong heirs, any of whom were capable of succeeding him. In order to maintain a strong alliance with Mercia against the Vikings, Æthelwulf married his daughter Ælfswith to Burgred, who was the new king of Mercia. In that same year, Æthelwulf went on a joint mission with Burgred to subdue part of North Wales, which he did quite effectively. A year later, Æthelwulf would make the most controversial decision of his reign. In 854, Æthelwulf announced that he would be going on a pilgrimage to Rome, leaving his kingdom in the hands of his two eldest living sons while he was gone. Æthelbald was granted control of Wessex, while Æthelbert was given Kent. This decision was an unprecedented one for an Anglo-Saxon king. Travelling all the way to Rome while leaving your kingdom in the hands of others was something that seemed completely insane to many at the time. The fact that he felt so secure in his throne is remarkable, especially given the climate involving the Vikings at the time. There are many theories as to why Æthelwulf would choose to make this pilgrimage. Some historians have suggested that Osburh had died shortly beforehand, given that it was known that she passed away before 855. Others have argued that Æthelwulf was instead hoping that this pilgrimage would help cleanse the soul of Wessex, given that many seem to have believed that the Vikings were a sign of a lack of Christian virtue. However, the most likely answer was that Æthelwulf wanted to demonstrate that Wessex was not a half-heathen, uncultured kingdom. At the time, there was a degree of snobbery directed towards the British Isles, as not being as sophisticated as mainland Europe, and Æthelwulf hoped that by parading himself and his wealth through Francia and on to Rome, he might be able to dispel that myth. One puzzling detail is that Prince Alfred was said to have accompanied him on his pilgrimage. While it is possible that he had already returned with his brother, it seems unlikely that Æthelwulf would have brought him back a second time. Instead, it seems more possible that Æthelwulf followed his two younger sons and met them on their return from Rome. Although Æthelred is not mentioned as having gone on a pilgrimage with Æthelwulf, this might simply be explained by the fact that most sources describing the pilgrimage were written years later, during the reign of Alfred the Great, who had no interest in playing up Æthelred's presence. However, all of this was compounded by another strange matter just before Æthelwulf set off for his pilgrimage. In 854, or 855, Æthelwulf issued the controversial Decimation Charter, which released 1/10 of his land from his control. This is another fiercely debated topic, as the reasoning for this is not recorded. Whether this was to help with economic growth, or in payment or reward for local lords and the church, are unknown, yet this remains a controversial subject within academic circles. Æthelwulf set off for Rome in 855, and, after staying with Charles II of Francia for a time, he reached Rome, where he remained for a year. During his time, the Æthelwulf lavished the nobility of Rome, as well as the clergy, with many fine gifts made of gold and rare silk. Not least of his gifts was a solid gold crown weighing 1.8 kilograms. These gifts rivaled those given by the Frankish Empire, establishing Wessex and England at large as a rich and powerful land. After his time in Rome, Æthelwulf returned to stay with Charles II, bringing Alfred and presumably Æthelred with him. It was there that Æthelwulf would make another controversial decision. After helping Charles put down a Viking attack, his host offered him an alliance between the two kingdoms, sealed with a marriage between Æthelwulf and Charles's daughter Judith, who was only 12 or 13 at the time. This offer was unusual, as Carolingian princesses didn't usually marry, instead joining nunneries when they were old enough. Æthelwulf agreed to the marriage, and on October 1st of 856, Æthelwulf and Judith were wed at Verbières. At the end of the ceremony, Judith was anointed with holy oil and proclaimed Queen of Wessex. This was also very controversial. In Wessex, the wife of a king was not granted any title of importance nor a throne. She was simply the king's wife, and was largely kept away from politics. Since it was so rare for Carolingian women to marry, Judith is believed to be the very first to ever be anointed. When news reached Wessex of Æthelwulf's actions, the response was immediate. Both Æthelbald and Æthelbert may have already been harbouring some rebellious thoughts before their father's departure, as well as a reluctance to hand their thrones back when he returned. However, it was this news of remarriage that sparked them to ultimately take up arms against their father. While most of the clergy and nobility rallied against the idea of an anointed queen, Æthelwulf's sons had a different concern. Judith was a Carolingian, a descendant of Charlemagne. Any children she produced would therefore have a strong claim on the throne of Wessex and the support of the Frankish Empire, which would jeopardize their own positions. Æthelwulf became aware of his son's rebellion before he returned, but after discovering that a number of his closest friends and advisors were supporting his sons, he ultimately chose not to fight them for control. Instead, his priority seems to have been to avoid a civil war, so he agreed to willingly hand over partial control of Wessex to Æthelbald, while Æthelbert would keep control of Kent. At this time there was an ancient division which ran between the centre of Wessex. This division came from a rivalry between the two bishoprics of Shelbourne and Winchester. Æthelwulf suggested that he would acknowledge Æthelbald as king of the western half of Wessex if he was allowed to keep control of the eastern half of Wessex and rule from Winchester. Æthelbald consented, and Æthelwulf took up his throne in Winchester, his one condition being that Judith was allowed to sit by his side on the throne. As Æthelwulf reached his late 50s, he began to make preparations for his death. At some point, he drew up his will, which bequeathed his share of Wessex to Æthelbald, Æthelred, or Alfred, whichever lived the longest. The fact that he didn't acknowledge Æthelbert suggests that he had intended for him to reign completely independently as King of Kent, and that Kent should be viewed as a wholly separate kingdom from Wessex forevermore. Æthelwulf also wrote that 300 gold coins were to be sent to Rome every year, and 1/10 of his land should be set aside to help feed the poor. Æthelwulf died on the 13th of January 858, less than 2 years after returning home. Upon his death, Æthelbald succeeded him as king of all Wessex, while Æthelbert continued to reign as king of Kent. Æthelwulf's life is often remembered primarily for his later years, and he is recalled by many as a king who lost his senses in his final years and began making foolish decisions that he should have known better to avoid. However, it must also be remembered that he was a highly respected monarch in his day who achieved a time of relative peace and wealth for his citizens. His skill in battle made him a formidable force on the field, and he surpassed all of his contemporaries in putting down Viking attacks, himself outshone only by his most famous son.